The morphine syringe clutched in a medic's trembling hand represented more than pain relief. It was the invisible line between a soldier's scream and his silence, between retreat and holding the position, between life slipping away in agony and a fighting chance at survival. But behind this miracle of battlefield medicine lay a darker truth. The same pharmaceutical ingenuity that saved countless lives also created legions of addicts. And the journey from poppy field to soldier's vein was paved with scientific ambition, corporate competition, and the brutal calculus of war. In the summer of 1898, while European powers jockeyed for colonial dominance and America grappled with the aftermath of its war with Spain, a chemist named Heinrich Dresser stood in the laboratories of Friedrich Bayer and Company in Elberfeld, Germany. Before him lay the culmination of years of research into opium derivatives, a white crystalline powder that would soon bear a name suggesting heroic strength: heroin. Bayer marketed diacetyl morphine as a non-addictive alternative to morphine, a cough suppressant of unprecedented power, a wonder drug for tuberculosis and pneumonia that ravaged industrial cities. The company's confidence seemed justified by initial reports. Heroin appeared to lack morphine's tendency toward dependence, or so the early medical literature suggested. Within a year, Bayer was exporting the drug to 23 countries, and physicians worldwide embraced it as a pharmacological breakthrough. The irony would become apparent only later. Heroin was not less addictive than morphine. It was catastrophically more so. The acetyl groups attached to the morphine molecule allowed it to cross the blood-brain barrier with devastating efficiency, delivering a more intense euphoria followed by a more desperate craving. But in those early years, as the 20th century dawned, heroin represented the cutting edge of pharmaceutical science. And when war came, military medical establishments across the globe possessed stockpiles of what they believed to be a superior analgesic. The poppy fields of Turkey, India, and Persia had supplied the raw opium for centuries. But the First World War transformed these agricultural products into strategic resources as vital as steel or petroleum. The process began with incisions in the unripe seed pods of Papaver somniferum, made in the cool hours before dawn. Farmers scored the bulbous capsules with small blades, allowing the milky latex to seep out and oxidize in the air, darkening to a brown resin that would be collected the following morning. This raw opium contained roughly 10 to 15% morphine by weight, along with codeine, thebaine, and dozens of other alkaloids. The transformation from crude opium to medical-grade morphine required sophisticated chemistry. Manufacturers dissolved the raw opium in hot water, filtering out plant debris and insoluble compounds. Adding calcium hydroxide precipitated unwanted alkaloids, while morphine remained in solution. Concentration, filtration, and treatment with ammonium chloride yielded morphine base, which was then reacted with hydrochloric or sulfuric acid to produce morphine salts stable enough for medical use and storage. German pharmaceutical companies, particularly Merck and Bayer, dominated this trade before 1914, their chemists having perfected purification techniques that yielded consistently potent products. To create heroin, chemists heated morphine with acetic anhydride, a process that acetylated the hydroxyl groups on the morphine molecule, producing 3,6-diacetyl morphine. The reaction required careful temperature control, typically between 80 and 85 degrees Celsius, maintained for several hours. The resulting crude heroin was then purified through multiple steps of dissolution, filtration, and crystallization, producing the white powder that seemed so clinically pure, so divorced from the sticky resin scraped from poppy pods in distant fields. When the guns opened fire in August 1914, the scale of casualties overwhelmed every medical prediction, and the industrialization of warfare had created a nightmare of torn flesh and shattered bone that pre-war medical establishments were catastrophically unprepared to handle. High-explosive artillery shells produced wounds unlike anything seen in previous conflicts. Shrapnel ripped through multiple organ systems simultaneously. The concussive force of nearby detonations liquefied internal organs without breaking the skin. Men buried alive by collapsing trenches suffered crush injuries that left them screaming in agony for hours before rescue. Gas attacks burned lungs and skin with chemical precision. The medical response evolved rapidly under this pressure. Field hospitals moved closer to the front lines, reducing the time casualties spent in agony before receiving treatment. The triage system, borrowed from French military medicine, categorized the wounded based on survival probability and treatment urgency.
Hold still, soldier.
Those with mortal wounds received comfort care, often heavy doses of morphine to ease their final hours. Those with survivable injuries received the minimum pain control necessary to stabilize them for transport to rear area hospitals. And those with minor wounds were patched up and returned to the trenches as quickly as possible. Morphine and heroin became the cornerstones of this system. The drugs worked by binding to opioid receptors in the brain and spinal cord, blocking pain signals and producing a sense of detached calm that allowed medical personnel to perform necessary procedures on conscious patients. A soldier with a mangled leg could endure amputation with morphine, his screams reduced to quiet moans, his thrashing stilled enough for the surgeon's saw to do its work. A man with abdominal wounds could survive hours of transport over shell-cratered roads, the morphine dulling the agony of each jarring bounce. The delivery mechanisms evolved alongside the medical need. Early in the war, morphine came in glass ampules that required breaking and drawing the solution into a hypodermic syringe, a process too complex and time-consuming for the chaos of frontline medicine. American medical officers developed the morphine syringe, a small tube with an attached needle sealed and ready for immediate injection. A medic could grab a syringe, twist off the protective cap, jab it into a wounded soldier's thigh or arm, and squeeze the tube to deliver a precise dose, all in seconds and often under fire. The British and Germans adopted similar systems, and by 1917, every combat medic carried morphine syringes as standard equipment. The quantities consumed were staggering. The American Expeditionary Forces alone used over 30 tons of morphine between April 1917 and November 1918. British forces went through similar amounts. German medical services, cut off from Turkish opium supplies by Allied naval blockades, turned to synthetic alternatives and rationed their morphine stocks carefully, prioritizing officers and specialist troops over common soldiers. This disparity in pain management may have affected morale as much as any tactical consideration. Knowing that a wound would mean hours or days of untreated agony made men more hesitant to advance, more willing to seek cover, and more prone to the psychological collapse then called shell shock. But the drugs that saved lives in field hospitals created a secondary casualty list that would haunt the post-war years. Soldiers who received repeated doses during long recoveries developed physical dependence, their bodies adapting to the constant presence of opioids by downregulating natural pain control systems and increasing the number of opioid receptors. When the morphine stopped, withdrawal began. Sweating, nausea, muscle cramps, anxiety, insomnia, and an overwhelming craving for the drug that had been their salvation. Many soldiers left the war carrying not just visible scars, but an invisible hunger that would destroy their civilian lives. The medical establishment initially failed to recognize the scale of the problem. Addiction was poorly understood in the early 20th century, often viewed as a moral failing rather than a physiological condition. Veterans who sought continued prescriptions for morphine or heroin were frequently labeled as malingerers or weaklings. Some doctors, recognizing genuine suffering, continued to prescribe, inadvertently maintaining addictions that might otherwise have been endured and overcome. Others refused, condemning former patients to seek relief from black market sources or criminal suppliers. The interwar period saw heroin transition from medicine to menace in public consciousness. Cities across America and Europe grappled with growing populations of addicts, many of them veterans. The drug's reputation shifted from wonder cure to social poison. Nations began restricting its manufacture and prescription. The 1925 International Opium Convention attempted to control global production, though enforcement remained spotty and loopholes abundant. By the time the Second World War arrived, heroin had been largely abandoned for medical use in favor of morphine, which was itself being challenged by newer synthetic opioids like meperidine. Yet morphine remained indispensable. The Second World War produced even more casualties than the First, and medical services consumed even larger quantities of opioid painkillers. The American military alone procured over 400 tons of morphine between 1941 and 1945. The drug came in improved Surette designs, more stable formulations, and was accompanied by better training for medics in proper dosing and administration. The lessons of the First World War had taught medical planners to anticipate addiction as a consequence of treatment, and efforts were made to limit long-term use and provide gradual dose reduction for recovering casualties. The Pacific Theater presented unique challenges. The jungle environment, the difficulty of evacuation, and the nature of Japanese tactics meant that wounded men often spent longer periods before reaching hospital care. Morphine Surettes had to function reliably in extreme heat and humidity. Medics learned to guard their drug supplies zealously, knowing that capture by Japanese forces often meant torture, and that morphine might be the only mercy they could offer to comrades who fell into enemy hands. There are documented cases of soldiers using their final Surettes for suicide rather than endure interrogation, a grim testament to both the drug's power and the desperation of combat. The European theater saw morphine deployed in massive quantities during the initial D-Day landings and subsequent campaigns. Beach medics on Omaha and Utah beaches went through their Surette supplies in hours, the wounded lying in rows on the sand, waiting for treatment and evacuation. The winter battles in the Ardennes and the final push into Germany produced casualties at rates that strained medical logistics. Supply lines had to ensure that morphine moved forward as reliably as ammunition and food. Failure to maintain stocks meant men dying in agony, morale collapsing, and combat effectiveness degrading. Behind the front lines, the pharmaceutical industry worked at maximum capacity. American companies like Merck, Mallinckrodt, and Pennick expanded production facilities and hired thousands of workers to process raw opium into medical morphine. The opium itself came primarily from Turkey and India, shipped under heavy naval escort to avoid submarine attacks. The manufacturing process remained labor-intensive and chemically complex, requiring skilled workers who understood the delicate balance of heat, timing, and chemical reagents needed to produce pure, potent morphine salts. Quality control became a matter of life and death. Underdosed morphine failed to control pain, leaving soldiers in agony and unable to endure necessary medical procedures. Overdosed morphine killed through respiratory depression, the drug suppressing the brainstem's automatic breathing reflex until patients simply stopped inhaling. Military contracts specified exact potency ranges, and manufacturers faced severe penalties for batches that fell outside acceptable parameters. Testing involved not just chemical assays, but biological trials, often using laboratory animals to verify that the morphine produced the expected analgesic effects at the expected doses. The Soviet Union faced particular challenges with opioid supply. Cut off from traditional opium sources and lacking the pharmaceutical infrastructure of Western nations, Soviet medical services often relied on inferior domestic morphine or even crude opium preparations. Shortages were common, and many wounded Red Army soldiers endured procedures with minimal or no pain control. Soviet medical personnel developed techniques for nerve blocks and regional anesthesia that reduced reliance on systemic opioids. So innovations born from desperate necessity that would later influence post-war anesthesiology. German forces, facing similar supply constraints due to Allied blockades, turned increasingly to synthetic alternatives. Pethidine, marketed as Dolentine, became a standard Wehrmacht analgesic by 1943. While less potent than morphine, it could be synthesized entirely from petroleum derivatives, freeing German medical logistics from dependence on agricultural opium. The drug had its own problems, including a tendency to cause delirium at high doses. But it kept German medical services functional when morphine supplies dwindled to critical levels. The long-term consequences of wartime opioid use extended far beyond individual addiction cases. The massive expansion of pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity created an industry infrastructure that would drive post-war pain management innovations. Research into opioid receptors and mechanisms of action, initially military-funded, laid groundwork for modern pharmacology. The development of antagonists like nalorphine, which could reverse opioid overdoses, grew directly from wartime experience with morphine toxicity.
You're doing very well.
But the human cost remained devastating. Tens of thousands of veterans returned home physically dependent on morphine or heroin, their nervous systems rewired by months of medical treatment. Some managed gradual withdrawal with medical support. Others spent decades cycling between sobriety and relapse, their lives defined by the craving for a drug that had once been their salvation. Family members watched helplessly as men who had survived the worst combat conditions succumbed to addiction, their bodies and minds gradually destroyed by the same substance that had kept them alive on the battlefield. The pharmaceutical companies that had profited enormously from wartime opioid production faced little accountability for the addiction epidemic that followed. Bayer's early claims about heroin's non-addictive properties were quietly forgotten. The focus shifted to controlling illegal markets and punishing addicts rather than examining the medical and commercial decisions that had created the crisis. It would take decades before the medical establishment fully acknowledged the addictive potential of prescription opioids and began developing more cautious prescribing guidelines. Today, the lessons of wartime morphine use remain relevant as modern medicine grapples with another opioid crisis, this one driven by synthetic drugs far more potent than anything available in 1945. The fundamental tension remains unchanged. Opioids are extraordinarily effective pain relievers, indispensable for treating severe acute pain. But they carry an addiction risk that cannot be eliminated through chemistry alone. The medic's choice on a battlefield, whether to relieve suffering or withhold a potentially addictive drug, echoes in every doctor's office where chronic pain patients seek relief, and physicians weigh therapeutic benefits against dependence risks. The morphine syringe in that medic's hand was never just medicine. It was a devil's bargain, trading future suffering for present survival, mortgaging tomorrow's well-being for today's battlefield advantage. The men who received those injections in the mud of Normandy or the jungles of Guadalcanal lived because of morphine. But some portion of them paid for that survival with decades of craving, withdrawal, and desperate seeking. Their story is a reminder that the weapons of war include not just guns and bombs, but also the substances we use to endure war's consequences, and that those substances carry their own casualties long after the shooting stops.